So last week, we acknowledged the end of year one of this lockdown, lock up, shut down, quarantine, flattening the curve, fighting the virus, masking, social distancing. And we acknowledge it all week this week, as I've said during this service. And this week, wow, the Psalms class, thank you to Harold Levine and Annika Cooper and Sherry Felt-Dradfield for organizing a beautiful class recital and play of music and art and personal offerings. So that in looking back on this year, we didn't only focus on the losses and the pain and the anguish and the death and sadness and sickness, all of which is there. But we also are aware of the creativity that can happen when we call upon ourselves to not only just hide into the cave of our anxieties, but to carry them with us and see what we could do when we create into the world. And so the Psalms group continues every Monday through Thursday. New people are always welcome to join us as we continue in this year two to figure out what is it that God wants of us? What do we want of each other? So year two, we start tonight the Parsha of Vayikra, which is the book of Leviticus. And as we figured out earlier tonight, I thought we were 2 weeks away from Pesach, but of course we're only 1 week. The Seder begins tomorrow, a week from tomorrow night. Pesach is this, and Nisan, as a result, is this time of focusing on liberation. And the period leading into Pesach is about our personal preparations. What are the things that hold us back? Where are the places of constriction that keep us from being or feeling liberated? Some have said that the chametz itself, the leaven that we rid ourselves of as we prepare for Pesach, can be thought of as ego or the obstacles of our personalities that get in the way of our accomplishing the fullness of who we are. And we need to get rid of that chametz. We need to get rid of the things inside of us that prevent us from becoming the fullness of who we are. Sometimes those things that I think of as chametz, the things that we need to some degree, everybody needs ego to some degree. Everybody needs ambition to some degree. When that degree is on high charge, we get lost. We can't remember exactly who we are. And chametz is an example of something very different than, for instance, pork or other things that are not kosher any time of the year. Chametz represents things that are okay most of the time in proportion, but in excess, and some of the time they're not okay. So what we do by stopping eating chametz for the 7 or 8 days of Pesach, depending where you are, is to remind ourselves of the discipline of removing some things from us that if they become too puffed up, like leaven becomes puffed up, inflated, we have to bring it back into alignment with what we actually need. Sometimes it's our ego that becomes too fluffed up. Sometimes it's our anxieties which become too fluffed up. And when they are out of control, they are obstacles. They are barriers for us to become fully the people we can be. One of those pieces of chametz, I think, is the concept or expectations themselves. Expectations is a form of chametz, I think. So what do I mean by that? Obviously, expectations are important most of the year, right? So the idea is what is important in proportion, in ratio that is healthy, and what do we sometimes have to sit down and examine and rethink entirely. You've often heard me say the line that we have to let go of the expectations of what we thought our life would look like in order to make room for the life we are actually living. That sometimes expectations of the ways things should be stop us from actually experiencing the blessings of the way they are, or the reality of the blessings we have in our life. And we sometimes focus on those expectations of maybe what we imagined when we were young our life would look like. Maybe we imagined what our personal lives would look like, or our professional lives, or our financial lives. And somehow we haven't achieved what we imagined. What we have to do is let go of those expectations in order to make room for the life we are living now. There are some people I think of as models for that, of how to think about what to do when there is such a radical transformation of our lives that we don't know what to do, or we can't imagine. So there are a couple of examples I want to give that are meaningful to me. The famous pianist, Murray Pariah, by the way, not many people know, but his name was actually Parachia. He is a Jew. He was from a Jewish family from Greece. He was from a Sephardic Jewish family, Parachia. But in English, his name was Pariah, a very, very, very famous American pianist, many of whom, of course, were Jewish. Some of you know the famous story about him that at a certain point in his life, his right thumb, here he is a world famous pianist, his right thumb was cut and infected, and he couldn't play piano anymore. This was his life. Everything he knew about how to express himself couldn't happen. He couldn't play piano anymore. He couldn't give concerts. He was no longer the Murray Pariah that the world knew so well. And he wrote later of this period of his life in which he was in exile from what he experienced as the very existential identity of himself. He said he decided that if he couldn't make music, which had been his life, he would study music. And he dedicated as many hours a day as he used to practice the piano, which anybody who knows a professional pianist is playing the piano many, many, many hours a day. He decided to study Bach. He couldn't play, he couldn't make music, but he could study. So he dove into the limitation of his life without being able to play, with a diseased hand, so to speak. And instead, he spent this kind of sabbatical from playing piano studying Bach. He actually recovered his ability to play, and he then became famous for his recordings of Bach. And he talked often in the later part of his life about what it was like studying Bach and taking a sabbatical from being the pianist everybody knew him to be. And he did not know whether he would ever recover the ability to play again. But he decided instead of just feeling sorry for himself, he would study Bach, which he has a lot of writings on about the impact that those years of study had on him internally and ultimately as a musician. Another musician, Leon Fleischer, also Jewish, but from his family was from Eastern Europe, and by the way, was a teacher of Joyce, our very own Joyce Rosenzweig. Leon Fleischer famously had a problem with his right hand, and they ultimately diagnosed it, but for a long time he didn't know what it was. And he could not play a two-handed piano. He couldn't play with two hands, and his right hand would not work. And he went on to explore what's known as the left hand repertoire of the piano repertoire. And he explored it and explored it and explored it, and he found manuscripts that had never been recorded. And he became famous for being a left-handed pianist. He also then went on to have a spectacular career as a teacher and a conductor. But can you imagine, as a pianist, losing forever his ability to use his right hand? And he had to let go of that expectation and decide, was he going to curl up in a ball on the floor and leave music altogether? And no, what he did is he figured out how to do something with what he had left. Instead of focusing on the fact that he could not play two-handed piano anymore, he explored and went into deep the repertoire of left-hand piano pieces. And finally, I want to share with you a story, that life that's very important to me personally, which is Henri Matisse, the great painter. Were I at home, in my study at home, from which I usually teach and lead services, I have behind me one of Matisse's last piece of art that he ever made. And Jason, would you put it up on the screen, please, so everybody could look at it while I'm speaking? So Henri Matisse, many you've us very well familiar. He was in the early part of the 1900s, a very famous figure for many years as a painter and a sculptor. He was in the Picasso generation and very connected to Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein. They were very early collectors of his. And they had a Saturday night salon every week in Paris that Matisse was a very, one of the central core people in that salon. And Matisse was a very famous painter and sculptor, and I'm not going to go through his entire career. I'm sure many in our congregation know his work well, and a beloved painter and sculptor for decades and decades and decades. And then he was born in 1869, and then in 1941 he had abdominal cancer. He had to have multiple surgeries, and he never really recovered. After the initial surgery from abdominal cancer, he was bedridden and wheelchair bound. And he got sicker and sicker and sicker until the point was he couldn't leave his bed at all. So initially, after the recovery from surgery, and by the way, he stayed in France as he could because he wasn't Jewish, because he didn't want to abandon France during the occupation. And many of his relatives and his chevra were very active in the resistance. And that's a whole other story, but we'll leave that for now and just get to his life as an artist. And then Matisse could no longer paint because he couldn't paint and he couldn't do sculpture anymore. This is after decades and decades and decades of being a world famous artist. Now, he no longer could create art the way he had for over 40 years, but he was still in his soul an artist. He still had something to say. And again, like Fleischer and like Pariah, he didn't just curl up into a ball of despair and say, because I cannot do what I have done before, I will do nothing. He found the art form of paper cuts. And we know he had a great body of art, of paper cuts, that if you don't know about his particular biography, you see it as just another fantastic expression of Matisse's art. But he couldn't paint and he couldn't sculpt. He had never done paper cuts before to the degree after 41 he started exploring. And then he arrived at a point where he himself could no longer cut the paper and he could no longer glue it onto the canvas. He became so sick in the early 50s. And all he could do is from his bed, direct an assistant how to cut the paper and where to put it on the canvas. This piece of art you're looking at right now is one of the last things that Matisse did. And by did, I mean he physically could not do it anymore, but he instructed his assistants how exactly to cut and how exactly to place each piece of paper. And this very, very, very famous piece, which is in the Tate Museum in London, where I saw it, and I know there was a great exhibit here at MoMA some years ago, where many of the paper cuts from Tate came to MoMA. But this piece of art I keep in my study all the time. And it's called, by the way, The Snail, to remind myself of Matisse's learning. This piece of art was done in 1953. He died less than a year later in 1954. One of the last things he did. He did this when he could no longer use his own hands, but he used somebody else to help him create the art. So this Pesach is what I believe is our struggle to let go of expectations that limit us. As we go into this second year of this virus, we don't know, are we at the beginning of the end with the vaccine and the hopefulness that the vaccine presents us? Or will so many people refuse or not be able to get the vaccine that it will not ultimately free us? Are we at the beginning of the end of this moment in history where we came close to white supremacists taking over this country? Or will we look back and know this was just a blip and we're in for a long haul ahead? When the virus first hit, when 2016 happened and Trump was first elected, we could jump into crisis mode. Adrenaline flows in some ways. It was hard for sure, but we as a community came together and figured out what we needed to do. We're facing something different now. We don't exactly know what the crisis is and whether it's forever ahead of us, whether it's another year or 2 years or 20. And we have to do the hard work of letting go of expectations of things just turning from bad to good or abnormal to normal. We keep saying when we get back to normal, we don't know what to expect. But what we do know is that if we remain connected to the big idea of being human, then the limitations that will get placed on us will not defeat us. When we understand that we're on a journey together, that each of us has something to offer, that we can't be defeated by the ways we are limited, either by our own limitations or by the limitations of the world, we can still be creative and put out important, life-changing beauty that decades later we can listen to a Leon Fleischer recording or to a Murray Pariah recording or look at a Matisse and feel the connection to the divine. So I pray that this Pesach season, this Zman Cherutenu, this time of our liberation, will also be a time of liberation from the expectations that defeat us and allow us to become truly free. Shabbat Shalom.